here, and I want to share a few minutes of a very personal connection with Jim. I was doing some early work here, managing some XP teams, extreme programming teams, way back in the early 2000s. And Bob Payne, who's here, my colleague, he was my coach, first Agile coach. And we had started working on, at that time, what had been what turned out to be one of the largest Agile projects in the world, right? And we were looking for ways to do things differently. We'd done this XP stuff and we had to scale it. So I had started looking at Jim's work. And I don't know which came first, whether I actually met Jim first or talked to him first, or I read this book. If you haven't read it, this is a book that changed my life. It's called Adaptive Software Development. I believe it's Jim's first book. And the thing that impressed me so much is that it had a connection to a theoretical basis that persists today and is timeless. It's something called complex adaptive systems, and it really underpins everything within Agile methods. Now, Jim has written a number of other books, right, from Mike Griffiths, and we were just talking, and he said Agile project management was very transformative to him and his life. But very simply, I owe personally Jim an enormous debt of gratitude for all this work that he put out and all of the definitive things that he did that have brought us to this day today, 20 years later with the Agile Manifesto. Jim and I have also collaborated over the years. He invited me to join the Agile Project Leadership Network, and we spent time on the board. And over the years, you can see Jim's evolution of thinking right up to his latest book. It's called Edge, Value-Driven Transformation, to this day. And I believe he's just retired. So it is with great privilege and with distinct pleasure that I introduce my friend and mentor, Jim Highsmith. I hope you enjoy his talk.
Thanks, Sanjeev. I really appreciate that. This has been kind of a week for me to be kind of nostalgic. I just retired after spending 10 years with ThoughtWorks. And as we talked about earlier, I can't imagine it's been that long. It's the 20th anniversary of Agile this week. And I've now spent 54 years of my career in IT, and I just had my 75th birthday. So
happy birthday.
So I'm going to be a little nostalgic and kind of delve into the history of what came before Agile for me. And I think every one of the manifesto signers, authors, has their own history of how they got to where they are. But I just wanted to go back and sort of spend most of my time talking about the time up to and just after the manifesto. And then I'll respond to questions about other time frames. So all during the 1980s, I used, sold, taught classes on waterfall and structured development methodologies. So I was really one of the waterfall guys back in the 80s. And towards the end of the 80s, I started thinking more about like, yeah, all this stuff is okay, but that's not the way I work. And I was getting tired of the documents and all that kind of stuff. And so I ended up writing an article in American Programmer in 1992 called A Software Sense, which began to sort of outline my kind of philosophy. So this is really the genesis of my own rapid application development method. So RAD was popular during this period of time. And I got this call in the early 1991 or something like that from a guy by the name of Sam Baird. And Sam worked as a marketing manager for Amdahl, computer manufacturer at the time. A lot of you probably never heard of Amdahl. But what they had is they had a rapid development tool that they had developed, but the sales cycle was forever. They couldn't sell the thing in a reasonable time frame. And so what Sam wanted to do was to develop a RAD methodology and use this in a marketing effort. So he and I did that, and you know, RAD at the time, a lot of the methodology vendors thought RAD was just removing some documentation and removing some tasks, and then it would be radical. So what Sam and I developed a 1-month project with 1-week iterations 1 to 2 day inception, and teams of 2 to 4. And we would go into a client, a potential buyer for their RAD tool, and we would do a project for them in a month. And we did some measurements, and we tended to be 10 to 15 times as productive as they were internally. And so this really began my approach to kind of rapid iterative development. We did this 1 month project for a large bank in New York City one time. And it was a very successful project. We did it in a month, and we gave them some beneficial results. And then we went down to ops and said, would you like to install this for us? They said, yes, that'll be 6 months. And we ran into that kind of issue a lot, as Sanjeev will attest to, during Agile implementations in various and sundry different areas. Towards the middle of the 90s, I worked for a large apparel company on the West Coast. They had an 18-month project that they had been working on. And in 18 months, what they had was a requirements definition document, and that was all. And that document was out of date by the time they finished it. And the VP of the department was not very happy about this, the VP of the apparel company. And so we started a new project for them, and I did a lot of consulting and training and mentoring during this project. We did a 6-month project with 1 month's iterations. It was interesting. We hit a different kind of roadblock in this one. So after the first iteration, I went to the database administrator who had been in the training, and I said, we need to do the next rendition of the database. And he said, can't do that. He said, in the beginning of the project, you got to tell us what the structure of the database is and all the database elements, and we put them up for you and we don't change it. And I said, well, you don't understand. This is an iterative development process, and we need to change the database every iteration, and maybe sometimes more than that. He said, you don't understand. So we went back and forth like this a couple of times. And finally I said, okay, let's go up to the VP's office and talk to her about how we're going to do this project, because she has agreed to do this more rapid development type project. And he just said, well, maybe there's a way we can figure it out. So, but database database people in that era of time weren't very conducive. At the first focus group that we had, the VP was just blown away after having spent 18 months and only getting a document. To actually see something on the screen after a month was really, she really liked that. And we developed a working product in about 6 months. About this time, as Sanju said, I was working on the book that he talked about, Adaptive Software Development. Before it became adaptive, it started out being radical software development, capital RID, little ICAL, radical software development. And I knew there was a chapter that was missing. I knew there was a chapter 3. I didn't know what it was. And I started reading about complex adaptive systems theory. And actually, over the next couple of years, I read more about science, about physics, and about biology than I did about software development. And so radical became adaptive. And during that period of time, I wrote a couple of articles for Software Development Magazine and one for the American Programmer that began to kind of flesh out my ideas about this adaptive approach to software development. In the beginning of, in the early 2000s, late 1990s, 98, 99, were kind of the early beginnings of Agile. And in a software development conference in Wellington, New Zealand in 1997, I met Martin Fowler, and we were both speaking at this conference, and we got to talking a little bit. And I sort of got plugged into the object-oriented community, which I really didn't have much interaction with at the time. And so as a result of that, and I'm not sure whether Martin put me on to Kent Beck or because of my association with Martin. But anyway, I found out that Kent Beck was working on his first book on extreme programming. And so Kent and I exchanged manuscripts. And that led to, there was a meeting in Rogue River, Oregon in the middle of 2000 or the early part of 2000. And Kent, it was basically an XP meeting, but Kent invited a couple of non-XPers, myself and Alistair Coburn for two. And so we really were discussing the future of XP. And I remember walking down the side of the river at a break time with Kent. And he was wondering about the future of XP. And he was concerned that the word extreme was too extreme for a lot of people at that time. And so I said, Kent, what are you going to call it? Moderate programming? So he kind of stuck with XP, which I knew he was going to do anyway. During the middle part of 2000, Bob Martin, we call Uncle Bob Martin, who had been at the Rogue River meeting, sent out an email saying they wanted to get some people together, but people more than just people involved in XP. And so a lot of us knew, you know, there was a little group over here doing Scrum, and there was a little group over here in Europe doing DSDM. There was a guy in Australia doing something called feature-driven development. And so we began to reach out to different people that some of us knew about. And Alistair and I agreed to host the meeting in Salt Lake City. We did talk about the Bahamas, but it was kind of hard to get to. We talked about, but in Bahamas, there were fun things to do. It was hard to get to. In Chicago, there was nothing fun to do. So we didn't want to go to Chicago. And so we ended up at Snowbird. And like I say, Alistair and I did a lot of the hosting and planning for that meeting. And we sort of pooled our knowledge of lightweight methods. Just before that, in late 2000, I wrote a cover article for Software Quality and Testing magazine entitled Retiring Lifecycle Dinosaurs. And again, that was another article, and a lot of others that were manifesto authors were also writing stuff during this period of time. And so that led to the manifesto meeting on February 11th, 2001, which was 20 years ago tomorrow. There's really no other word for it. It was a magical meeting. Who would have thought that 17 people, each with their own ideas about stuff, type A personalities, expert in their field, could get together and find some common ground in 3 days. There was no stated objective of the meeting. We didn't have an agenda. It just kind of evolved. And one of the first things we do is each of the 17 people stood up and just talked about what they were doing and what their philosophy and methodology was all about. Different people would step up at different times and facilitate the meeting. I think, although I can't recall exactly, it was 20 years ago, that Alistair stepped up and was facilitating some of the work on what were we going to call it? Because up to then, it had been called light or lightweight methodologies, and we didn't like being called lightweights. So we had a list, I don't remember, 15, 20 different names, of which Agile was one of them. And we worked on kind of paring it down and finally ended up with Agile. So it was a very interesting meeting. I've been in hundreds over my career, and it was probably the finest one. It was a real spontaneous, collaborative effort. I can't think of any time during the last 20 years when one of the authors has said, I did this part of it. It was all a collective effort. Even if there were some pieces of it that we knew that we as individuals had contributed to, nobody ever said, I did this part. You know, I came up with Agile, or I came up with this. It was a true collaborative effort and a collaborative product. The other thing that happened at that meeting is I had started working on another book, and I interviewed several people for that book. And so I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So what happened kind of immediately after the Agile Manifesto was written? It started off small. That they didn't have the social media that we have today, and so in August of 2001, Martin Fowler and I wrote an article that was a cover article in Software Development Magazine called the Agile Manifesto. In November, Alistair Coburn and I wrote an article for IEEE Computer, and then towards the end of the year, the Agile Alliance was founded. Just a couple of things that happened in that period of time too. XP 2002 was in Sardinia, Italy. And so I went to Italy and I was invited to speak. And this is kind of how stuff happened once in a while. I didn't know Martin Fowler was so sneaky. He invited me to a meeting of the organizers of the conference, just to he said, to meet some people and see what's going on. Next thing I knew, I was chair of the next year's conference, which was in Genoa, Italy. So I got a couple of trips to Italy out of that. The first Agile conference was June 2003 in Salt Lake City. Alistair and I did some of the early planning for that. I mean, the paper napkin part of the planning for the first Agile conference was done by Alistair and I. I then moved away from Salt Lake City during that period of time, so Alistair took over more of the planning than I did. It was a really successful conference, and it kind of grew from those beginnings. And I can't remember how many were in Salt Lake, 200 or 300, to what it is today, where 1,800 people show up. I talked about a book I was writing earlier called Agile Software Development Ecosystems. And why I wanted to write this particular book was it was a snapshot of each of the methodologies. It had a section on Scrum, a section on DSDM, a section on Lean, a section on Crystal. But the really important thing about this book was that I interviewed each of those people that were kind of responsible for those methodologies. People like Kent Beck and Ken Schwaber, Martin Fowler, and Ward Cunningham. I interviewed them and then wrote down or did a write-up in the front of different sections of the book. And it was really to delve into the past of how those people came to be, Agile or XP, or how they sort of developed over the years. So that's a real other history of how Agile sort of evolved in that book. And as you well know, there's lots and lots and lots of books and conferences and projects that kind of evolved out of that. But I think I'll sort of stop now and spend some more time just answering questions. And you may have more questions about some of the history, or you may have questions about today or things that happened since the manifesto was written. So I'll turn it on for questions and answers.
So Jim, first of all, I want to say those 68 words have so changed our world. I want to congratulate you and the rest of the folks who came up with that. I've been told that y'all wouldn't change a damn word in that document. You still hold to that?
Yep. It was written at a particular point in time, and you have to kind of understand what was going on the decade or two before that, and this was a major change. And one of the things that I think has been the strength of Agile, and if you think about it, not many movements like this have lasted for 20 years. It's sort of fads that go in and out, and Agile has really stuck around. And I think there are two reasons for that fundamentally. One is at its core, Agile is about values, and it's about people, and it's about collaboration, and it's about working with customers, and it's about code and getting products out the door. And the second part of Agile that I think is really important is that we postulated a new way of working together in terms of difference from kind of command control management. And in the book that Sanjeev put up, Adaptive Software Development, I really talked about leadership collaboration model as a very different kind of model for leadership and management than was done at the time. And since then, a lot has evolved in Agile. And I think one of the important pieces of it is because we had those core values, it really allowed things to build and change. And, you know, we did things like DevOps and Lean and some other things that, whether they're part of Agile or complementary to Agile, doesn't really make much difference. They're still part of this overall type of movement. So if I was to rewrite the manifesto now, I don't know what would come out. But I do know that none of the authors that I've talked to are particularly interested in any sort of rewrite.
Thank you, Jim. So I'm just going to jump in and moderate some of the things with the question. I see people with their hands up, and also I see questions in the chat. Mercy Leantor, you have your hand up. Could you just unmute and ask Jim your question?
Thank you so much.
I'm sorry?
Thank you, Sanjeev, and thank you so much, Jim, for that history. For me, I'm Nigerian, I'm in Africa. The key thing is, how do we bring the mindset to Africa? Because there's a massive gap with regards to the Agile mindset. With Lentor, that's our main focus, we're trying to bridge the digital skill gap. How can we bring the mindset? Because I've seen the value of Agile, I've seen the value of the mindset. How can we bring it to Africa? Speaking to the future of the manifesto.
I don't know. You know, I actually did a workshop in Johannesburg, South Africa, in like 1994 or 1995, somewhere in that range, when it was still the rapid application development. And that's really my only experience in Africa. And so I'm not as familiar with the cultures and how things work there. And I think that Agile is very much adapts to a particular culture, and how you do it in one culture may be different than the way you implement it in another culture. I was sitting with a vice president of a very large Chinese company at one of the Agile conferences. And we got to talking, and he said, how do I expand my Agile pilot to 200 projects? And I said, by doing 5 or 6 the next year instead of trying to do 200. He said, no, we got to do 200. Now, he had about 40,000 software engineers that reported to him. So it was a very different situation. And so I would say, from a cultural perspective, Julie Chickering, hey. There are people that I recognize their names from way in the past. It's kind of neat. I also saw a couple of others. So unfortunately, I don't have much of a recommendation for you in terms of doing it in Africa, other than finding somebody who has done something in similar situation and get some help with it.
Thank you, Jim. Rickard Jones has a question in the chat. He wants to know, is it the case that the original name for the manifesto was actually adaptive? And is there a story behind that too?
No, when we put all these words up on the bulletin board to kind of sort through and try to figure out what we were going to call it, adaptive was one of those words, but we decided not to use adaptive. We, in the final analysis, decided to use Agile. And I didn't push very hard for adaptive, because I figured that we probably didn't need a name of one of the existing methodologies as the overall umbrella. But anyway, so that's how that came about.
Okay. And then one more from the chat. Eugene Nkomba wants to know, how did you decide that 4 values were enough?
Well, one of the things is if you start getting more than about 4, nobody remembers it. You know, and those 4 covered a lot of ground. I mean, and you know, then there were some 12 principles that came after that. You know, we just thought those were the most important when we did it, and we didn't feel like we needed any more at the time. Whether there would be another couple that would be good to have, that's probably true. But again, I've reviewed a lot of papers and articles over the years, and invariably, particularly with technical people, they'll try to cover 10 or 15 items in an article. And I have to say, no, pick your main focus and write about that. Don't try to do 15 different things in a 2,000-word article. And I would say the same thing about Agile. You know, really think about those 4 values and the principles behind it. And you know, if you need to add something else for your particular environment, go right ahead.
Yep. I'm going to switch over to the Douglas. Douglas, you both you have your hand raised. Do you have a comment or a question? I see you have a comment in the chat as well, so please share. Thank you.
Yeah, we couldn't send direct chats in the chat, so I sent to everybody, but related to Africa. But for Mr. Highsmith, question would be, although you don't want to change the words of the manifesto, would you consider the idea that the manifesto has been used beyond software? And so a lot of people, you know, don't want to have it just specifically for software. So for education, or even in sales, or in HR department, or product development. So having that specific software in there, you know, is that too limiting, or it's just what it was and that's historical?
Well, I think it's historical. If you look at the, for example, I wrote a Agile project management book in 2004, and it talks about products beyond software. So I think the code word, you know, in the principle about delivering code, to me, that really talks about a product. In other words, think about delivering the product rather than the documentation, whether that's code or whether that's something else. So in the mid 2000s, I did a lot of work with a company up in Canada, in Toronto, Montreal, and they built medical machinery, medical testing devices, and we implemented a lot of the Agile principles at that company. I never got the electrical and mechanical engineers to do pair electrical design or pair mechanical design, but we implemented a lot of the other practices. So, you know, I think some people read it too restrictively, but I think of it in much broader terms.
Thank you. Frederick is asking us a little bit of a future looking view or perspective. He wants to know, well, first he says, thanks for sharing the history, but then the inevitable question is, where does the innovation of Agile take us next? He's interested in your perspective.
I don't know exactly where it'll take us next, but I will say that in the last 20 years, it's taken us to a lot of places. You know, Agile, that's one of the strengths of Agile, is there's been a lot of innovation with those 4 values sort of as the core. But you look at DevOps. You know, I was talking about the example that I used at a bank in New York City, where it took us 6 months to implement a new project into their system. And now there are companies out there that are doing, you know, 10, 15, 20 releases a day. So the whole DevOps and the automation of that was an innovation that came out of Agile. There's a lot of new sort of versions of Agile now. You know, I don't remember exactly what some of the names are, Agile Advanced or the new Agile or whatever. And those things are fine because they are innovating in new and different ways. For me, you know, I kind of went from Agile software development to Agile product development and Agile project management. And then the last couple of books I've written have been more about management. So adaptive leadership, and then the last book I wrote on digital transformation last year, well, actually in 2019. So I feel like I've moved from the basic Agile stuff that we did in the early 2000s to different kinds of things as I have sort of pushed my thinking over time. And I think a lot of people do that. And so I think that's the thing that has enabled Agile to survive and thrive over 20 years.
Thanks. So a question from our friend, Julie Chickering. She wants to know, what has been the biggest surprise to you in the last 20 years?
The biggest surprise. Well, I mean, it really, I think, has been a surprise that it's gone as far as it has, you know, that it really turned into such a phenomenon. I mean, there are not a lot of companies now that say they don't do Agile. There are definitely some. Whether they do it well or not, I'll leave that up for debate. But you know, I think that's been the biggest surprise, and also, you know, felt pretty good that it has gotten to this point where a lot of people in the world are using Agile. And you know, we're talking a lot now these days about agility in management too.
Yeah, thank you. So Rickard has another question. We ran out of other folks, so he's getting a little double dip over here. He said, the story I heard was that the values were created at the gathering, but the principles were created after the event via emails. Is that correct? Or something? That
is correct. So we wrote the values in 3 days. Okay, actually it was a shorter period of time than that. I think, but I can't really remember if we started to outline some of the principles when we were there, but we decided we didn't have enough time to do that. So we developed the principles over the next 3 or 4 months via email. We didn't have Google Docs back then. And I'll tell you, those were a much bigger pain in the ass than the values, because we wordsmith them to death. So that wasn't nearly as fun as the meeting where we came up with the values, but I think they're an important addition.
Thank you. So there's a lot of conversation in the chat about applying Agile to schools and to education. Anything that you'd like to chime in with it on that, Jim?
I'm not sure that I exactly know what the question is.
It's not a question, it's just a conversation, people sharing resources.
I'm sorry, are people sharing resources?
They're just sharing resources and examples of how Agile has been used in schools and education, and just wonder whether you had any observation on that.
Not really. I haven't done much in the area of education.
No worries. We'll move to the next one in the interest of time. Scott from Hadrian's Wall, I guess he must be in England, asks, what magic wand change would you wish to see in the community and companies with Agile transformation in the next 5 years?
Well, one of the things is I think you know that actually our health and economic and social upheaval of the last year is creating a greater need for Agile than ever, because I think the big thing that Agile addresses is uncertainty, and we've got a hell of a lot of uncertainty that's coming up, you know, over the next year or so as we you know, figure out more about this pandemic and we respond to it. And you know, in companies, some are going to have to respond a lot. Some of them, you know, if you were in the airline industry, you got hit pretty hard. If you were in the grocery business, you were okay. But I think the pace of change is going to pick up, which means that things like Agile development, agility and management, and those kinds of things are going to be even more important than they were in the past. And I think you see that in a lot of what's being written about by management consultants, I mean, big management consultants like McKinsey, you know, every now and then somebody says, when something appears in the Harvard Business Review, it's time to get out of it. But I don't. But you know, there've been a couple of Agile-like articles in HBR, and I don't think we're going to get out of it yet. But anyway, so I think I don't see any reduction in the future of understanding about Agile development.
Okay, thank you. And then we're sort of getting close to time, so maybe we can take a few more. Steve Zeiselman, a friend of ours, wants to know, what are your thoughts, and this one may be slightly controversial, what are your thoughts on the fact that Scrum has evolved to be the most popular framework, not necessarily the best, potentially to the detriment of the advancement of being agile and the appropriate application of broader principles? So take a shot at Scrum. I'm hearing.
In the 1980s, I worked for a large telecommunication company. I did some work at a large telecommunication company. And I helped them install their third waterfall methodology. And, you know, and the problem was that they didn't understand how to go about the whole organizational change thing. And in terms of Scrum, in terms of any of the Agile methodologies, they've all succeeded in doing better projects for people, and they've all failed. It's about the people first and the process and the approach second. Scrum has done really good things because they found the secret, which was you know, a 2-day certification, which made you a Scrum expert, right, Sanjeev? I know you've made a lot of experts in the people you've talked to, and some people have criticized it for that. But I think that Scrum, XP, Leans, Crystal, they've all added some things, and they've all had some good things done about them, and they've all been some things that we'd like to, you know, would like to have seen done better. I think the people who succeeded the best at Scrum added back in things like XP. I know that's one of the things you did, Sanjeev. And so you get the technical part and the project management part. So I don't really fault any of the approaches. I think they all have some good things about them. And it's about implementation. It's about, do you really know how to implement something like this, or do you not? So it's not so much about the approach as it is about the people who are trying to implement.
So related to that, and guilty as charged in terms of being a Scrum trainer and XP, Ron from Houston, Ron Whitebread, who you know, I believe, he runs the ALN group over there. Thank you, Ron. You have the largest ALN chapter in the world, I believe. He has a question. He says, does the mass marketing of various certifications run counter to the spirit of the Agile Manifesto's intent? Or do you say, more power to them to make a buck out of it?
That's a tough one. And Sanjeev, you know this because the Agile Project Leadership Network, which we both have helped found, wrestled with this for a long time in terms of what were we going to do certifications. And we ended up deciding not to. And so, you know, we sort of let PMI do it, right? So PMI does Agile Project Management certifications. I personally am not a big proponent of certifications of any type. But there's no question that the Scrum certifications and some other certifications have succeeded in getting more people involved. So, you know, one of the things I've mentioned to people before is talking about certifications. Let's say you're in a company and they want to hire people who are certified. Are we going to tell them, no, we're not going to certify anybody because we don't like certification? That's not really responding to the customer. So again, I have some ambivalence about certification, and particularly about Scrum certification, but in general, I think it's done well for the industry.
So here's another question, and this is from Dominique in France, and this is will take you back to the early days with OOPSLA and all that. pattern language was important in 2001, mainly with XP, but doesn't seem to be as much used today by the Agile community. What are your thoughts about that? So Jim,
I don't know. Yeah, I'm not as wired into what's happening today as I once was. 10 years ago, I've been doing a lot of internal work at ThoughtWorks. So it's not really an area that I feel very confident about talking about.
Okay. All right. Last question in the interest of time, just to make sure that we keep on target over here. Aisha, locally in the DC metro area, wants to know, how do you feel about the numerous books being written on Agile, taking the basic principles and then either advancing on them or changing them? Consulting at numerous enterprises, the biggest challenge that she faces is that she's seeing that everyone is getting a different approach and a different message. So 1,000 voices from 100 different channels, I guess, is what Aisha said.
Yeah. In any given movement like this, everybody piles on because they want to make some money, right? I mean, that's why we're sort of there. So, and you want to come up with something that will differentiate you from the other people, and so it causes some consternation in the marketplace because you've got too many choices, right? Now, back in the day, around the early part of the Agile movement, the bugaboo was the Software Engineering Institute capability maturity model. And so we would argue that, here you've got this big waterfall, document heavy, yada, yada, yada. And here you've got the lightweight Agile. I was actually on a panel one time at the SEI conference talking about Agile versus capability maturity model. And what struck me about that conference and about the difference was that the evaluation sheet after the conference was 17 pages long. And to me, that just kind of epitomized the difference between CMM and Agile. And we really needed that back then because we were trying to sell something that was very new. Now people are trying to sell something that's a small tweak on Agile. And there's some benefits in that, and there's some, detriments from that.
All right. Thank you so much, Jim. So I'm going to close this out and hand us back to our organizers in a second. But I just want to say that when you talked about complex adaptive systems and biology and chemistry and all that, it was a huge learning experience for me and as well. And so again, in your book, The Adaptive Software Development, anybody who reads Jim's book should always turn to the bibliography and look at all the references. And what I did was I went and read probably about 5, 6, 7 books at the one, got interested in complexity science and actually made a trip to the Santa Fe Institute back in the day in New Mexico. That's how much that particular model moved me personally. So I just want to offer that as a tribute and thanks to you for all 20 years of amazing work in this field. None of us would be here today if it weren't for you and the other 16 authors of the manifesto. And really appreciate you being here today. And thanks for your time and good luck with your retirement. It's hard to believe you're retiring.
I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.